Haying season is upon us, and if your hayfields look anything like the hayfields I've been trying to regenerate, they are prone to bare ground and needing some regeneration. Today, we're joined by Keith Burns of Green Cover Seed to talk about how to regenerate hayfields.
But we need all of these other things out there to supplement and to support these other microbial communities that are helping the soil do all these functions, whether it be taking the atmospheric nitrogen and making it available to the system, or pulling. Most of our soils are very rich in these minerals that we're putting on as fertilizers, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, boron, manganese. Well, those are in our soil. They're just not available to plant roots, and they're not available to all biology. And so we need to have as much a diverse microbial community out there as possible. And you're only going to get that with a diverse plant community, a diverse plant populations.
We'll also discuss the importance of livestock integration and what they can accomplish.
And the plants themselves aren't really doing it. It's the biology that associates with the plants, which are pulling that out of the inorganic portion and bringing it into the plant. And then once it's in the plant, then the animals, of course, can consume it. And then if you're managing it right and, you're grazing and you're moving, now those minerals are, 80%, 75, 80% of those minerals are coming out the back end of that animal. So now they're there for the next year. And so you start to build that cycle now. Whereas again, if you're haying it, that is going to be lost and you're not going to build that mineral supply like you would through grazing.
All that and more on this episode 444 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by the Patreon supporters and the Tire Winder.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. Very excited to be joined today by Keith Burns. Keith is, of course, one of the guys there at Green Cover Seeds and has been leading that organization for quite a while, and they're doing great work to supply cover crop seeds to people around the country who are looking to make the next step on their regenerative journey. And so very much appreciate Keith taking the time to join me today to talk about regenerating hayfields. And we'll have that conversation with Keith right after a word from our sponsor today, the Patreon supporters. I'll be honest, the spring and summer months are always the most challenging months in which to get out podcast and other content in a timely manner. And the feed over at the Patreon, over at patreon.com/workingcows reflects that. But Lord willing, in the next few days and in the coming weeks, we'll get caught up and have a whole boatload of bonus content coming out. I'm been pretty faithful to record, 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes more bonus content with every guest, but I don't always get it released at the same time. And so going to go through and crank out as many of those as I can over the next few days and try to get those coming. So if you're interested in bonus content or if you're interested in swag, there's new swag coming. If you're interested in any of that, you can go to patreon.com/workingcows, check out the levels and support at the level that's right to you. I really appreciate it. The Patreon supporters have been very faithful and very patient and such a blessing to my family over these many years. So head on over to patreon.com/workingcows to check that out today. And now a conversation with Keith Burns from Green Cover Seeds. Keith, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast.
Yeah, great to be here, Clay. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate the work that you and the team there are doing. And as was just telling you, we have this piece of land that's been entrusted to us that we are trying to regenerate. And we've been doing the grazing as best we can on it. And I think that there are some other opportunities out there to maybe increase the speed at which it regenerates, and I think cover crops is one of those strategies. And so when you look at and we can talk about different types of land. This is all old, tired hay fields that we're working with here. And so when you look at different types of land, or specifically hay fields, what are some of the things that you're going to think about as cover crop strategies on those acres?
Yeah. Well, like the first principle of soil health, the context is going to drive a lot of that conversation and those decisions, and even the options that you have. So the main thing that we would want to know on that is it a hayfield that is primarily consisting of cool season perennials or warm season perennials, because that's going to kind of determine what you can do. So here's the thing. It's really, really hard to get an annual established into a perennial setting if you've got any decent kind of standard perennial. And it's almost impossible to get a cool season annual established into a cool season perennial, because, when it comes to, lots of plants out there, the established ones, he who has the deepest roots is going to have access to the resources. And so typically what we would look at doing, and this would be the same if it's a hayfield or a grazing pasture, if you've got a perennial stand and you want to try to spice that up a little bit, add a little bit of diversity in there, with annuals, which can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done. The key there is you have to catch the perennials when they're at the most dormant state they're going to be in. And so, for a cool season pasture, cool season hayfield, that's going to be through the heat of the summer. And that's really only going to work when you have some rainfall to work with, or you can get irrigation on it. And then, we have seen some pretty good success of people coming in, say you have a brome pasture or, fescue or orchard grass or something like that. Well, those aren't very productive in the summertime. The heat is driving those cool season perennials into a kind of a semi-state of dormancy. And so what we'd encourage people to do is to go in there and you either graze it really hard and tight, or you mow it really low, fairly late into the active growing season, so depending on where you're at, that might be mid-June, late June, something like that. And then get in there and plant your warm season annuals, things like sorghums and millets and cowpeas, sunflowers, buckwheat, things like that. Stick them in the ground and then drop to your knees and pray for rain. Because it's not going to work if you don't get some rain. It can work really well if you catch a little bit of rain. And here's the thing, we're not doing a full seeding rate because, you're going into a situation where you've already got something growing. So we're not, putting $45 worth of seed out there or anything. Generally we would be looking at, maybe $20, $25 worth of seed. Well, how much growth do you have to get to pay for that? Not a lot. If you get half a ton of hay, half a ton of additional grazing, you paid for that pretty easily, and you're getting some of the soil health benefits that are going to come with that as well. So a lot of people figure even if I get something every other year, it's probably worth doing, or at least worth trying when the forecast sets up that it looks like it could be. Probably an easier scenario to deal with rather than the cool season perennials with the warm season annuals would be if you have a warm season pasture. You have switchgrass and big blue stem, little big blue stem, Indian grass, things like that. They're going to be very productive through the summertime. Come late summer, early fall, they're shutting down, and they're really not going to get started up again until it's late May, early June, depending on, again, where you're at. Well, this is a little bit easier scenario to work with, because now you can come in that late summer, early fall. You can plant things like, rye, triticale, annual ryegrass, clovers, peas, vetch, things that will give you some production in the fall, maybe over winter, maybe give you some spring growth. And then again, you either are clipping that for hay, or even better, if you can graze that. Nothing will regenerate a hayfield faster than bringing animals into it. Getting all that biology from the rumen, getting that out there. And one thing about grazing in the springtime before people have crops growing all over the place, it's a little bit easier to find your cows if they do get out. So a lot of people say, well, it's a hay field. I don't have any fence. I can't really graze it. Well, they make some pretty good portable fencing systems anymore. And I think that is a possibility. Yeah, you might have to haul water for a little bit, but man, I think you would just see a total rejuvenation by reintroducing the animals into a hay field in the off season. So you're not giving up that hay production, but you're trying to catch a little bit of grazing, from that off season annual. So, that's kind of the thought processes that we go through on that. And then again, if you want to try to establish perennials into perennials, that's a whole nother story. And we can talk about that too, if you want.
Yeah, I would like to talk about that, but we'll continue on here for a second on this idea. So when we're going to graze those, is there a certain number or a certain amount of time that we want to let that establish, or there's critical points, of course, in those plants' life cycles that we're going to want to not be there necessarily, is kind of what I'm assuming. And so are there some guidelines there as far as when we're planting and then when we're grazing?
Yeah, so from a when you're planting standpoint, you want to be pretty close to uh you know as that perennial is starting to decline in production and go into its dormant season. You don't want to wait till it's fully dormant, because then you've lost the growing season, too much opportunity. But you also don't want to be trying to be out there right at the peak, because if you're at the peak growing season and you go out and you hay it or you graze it, well, that stuff's going to want to grow back. That's what it does, and that's what it should do. And then that regrowth, it's just going to choke out, your new planting. And so you have to be late enough to where those perennials, they'll still regrow a little bit, but that regrowth isn't strong and vibrant, because that plant is sensing that the season for it to grow, like Ecclesiastes tells you, there's a season for everything. There's a season for that to grow, and there's a season for it to be dormant. And so you need to be closer to when it's going dormant than when it's, in full blown growth. So that's kind of the sweet spot. And you got to watch the forecast, if it looks like rain, or, you just got to kind of play that by ear. And then as far as grazing it, these scenarios, or even haying it, if you're clipping it for hay, you need to look at these as a one and done type deal, because you aren't there. The regrowth just probably isn't going to happen, because by the time it would regrow, your perennial is going to come back out of dormancy and take over. And that's what you want. We're not trying to replace the perennial. We're just trying to supplement it. We're trying to boost the biology of the soil system. And so you really need to look at this scenario as kind of a one and done, whether you're grazing or haying it. And so you would want to let that get to about the maximum amount of growth that you think you're going to get out of your supplemental planting, but do it before your perennials would really start waking up and want to come back strong. Because again, we don't want those perennials to wake up and come back, and then there's no sunlight because we've got this other crop, kind of crowding out the canopies. Do you want to be removing that just prior to your perennial crops waking up and getting going?
Yeah, and is the kind of the name of the game here with the perennials and introducing them into the annuals, introducing them into a perennial system, is the name of the game there kind of what the long-term benefit is going to be added carbon, that we're going to get some return back onto the surface of the soil, and that's going to be beneficial long-term?
Yes, the added carbon, but I think even more so than the surface of the soil is what's below the soil. Christine Jones, who I'm sure many of your listeners have, read a lot of her stuff, seen some of her webinars. Well, she was here last summer at our farm, and she clarified something that she had said earlier that I'd heard, that I don't think I heard it completely right. Uh, because I've been going around saying that the carbon that is going into the soil through the root system, that liquid carbon that's coming out through the roots, I've been telling people, it's 3 to 5 times more likely that carbon becomes part of your long-term organic matter than anything that lays on top of the ground and decomposes. And that wasn't exactly right, because she corrected me and said, no, it's 3 to 50 times more powerful and more impactful. And she says probably more like 30 to 50. So basically what she's saying is that if you want to really build soil organic matter, having that residue on top of the soil, it's important for a lot of things. It keeps the ground cool. It breaks the impact of that raindrop. It suppresses weeds. It prevents erosion. Does all those things. That's fantastic. That's great. But she's saying don't really count on all that. You're not going to boost your organic matter overnight by having tons and tons of residue on top of the ground, because as that gets consumed, just the natural process of degradation and cycling, much of that carbon is going to go back out to the atmosphere as CO2. That's the way things cycle. But what's in the ground, that's going through the root system, and as much as 50% of the carbon that a plant is making through photosynthesis, as much as 50% of that can end up in the soil as a root exudate. That is the powerful stuff. That's the stuff that is going to become much more likely to become organic matter. And that's where we see people have these, you hear reports of, I increased my organic matter 0.5% in 1 year, or 0.7% in 1 year. And some soil scientists they'll listen to that and they'll say, oh, that's not possible. It's not possible at all. But they're typically, when they say that, they're just looking at what's on top of the ground. And it absolutely would not be possible just with decomposing residue, because it's just, so much of that is just going to volatilize back the atmosphere. But when you're pumping all those root exudates, especially when it's in a really nice diverse mix and you've got all those different plant roots and plant types and plant families, you've activated all of these microbes, because it only gets the organic matter through a microbe. The carbon has to come out of the atmosphere into the plant, out the plant roots, into a microbe, and then the microbe has to die, and then that's what becomes your soil organic matter. And so that's a much more powerful system. So the more plants you have growing, the more of the time you're pumping that carbon into the soil and increasing and enhancing the biological community that you have there as well. And that's a hard thing to do, in a long-term hay situation. That's a very extractive system, because you're hauling all that residue away, all that biomass, all those nutrients away, but you are still getting the carbon into the soil through those roots growing. But anytime you can manage it to where you add more diversity, add more days of green plants growing, that's what's going to make your soil improve and get better.
Yeah, and I think I've picked this up somewhere along the line that annual the ground cover, the soil armor created by annuals is going to be less durable, less long lasting than the soil and armor created by perennials. Have you ever heard that?
Well, certainly that's going to be the case. And what it is, it boils down to a carbon nitrogen ratio thing, because typically annuals are getting hayed, grazed, terminated, whatever it is, before they reach full maturity. Because once they reach full maturity, you lose a lot of the nutritional content, you lose a lot of that value. And so typically you're harvesting those annuals in one shape or form or fashion. And the earlier they're harvested or grazed or hayed, whatever it is, the lower that C to N ratio is going to be, which means the less durable it is, the quicker it, decomposes, the quicker it cycles. There's some situations where you want that. If I'm doing a cover crop and I'm going to be planting corn, for example, I want those nutrients to cycle out a little quicker. I don't necessarily need a 6-inch mat of residue out there. Some people would, some people don't. The context will determine what that looks like. And so, that typically is what we see with annuals over perennials. But even with perennials, if you're not managing the grazing right, you still won't have much durable residue out there. And you don't have to do anything but drive around the county. You can see that, because there are plenty of people who are not managing their perennial pastures correctly, and there's just not much cover out there. And it's just a matter of, every time they get a little tiny bit of growth at a low carbon nitrogen ratio, they're out there hammering it off, and there's just no residue buildup.
And just as a refresher, what is that proper carbon and nitrogen ratio?
Well, again, it depends on, what your goals are. If you want it to cycle, probably 24 and under is going to be, where it starts to cycle pretty quickly. But, grass that's growing in the vegetative stage is probably going to be in that 20 to 24, that early vegetative stage. It's pretty low, you mow your lawn and it doesn't take very many days and you don't see a lot of those clippings anymore because they're breaking down, they're cycling. You spray out a cover crop that's 6 inches tall, you don't see it in a couple of weeks because it's just cycled so quick. But, if you don't mow your yard until it's, 18 inches tall or your cover crop gets 3 feet tall, well, that residue is going to be with you for a while because now that seed in ratio is probably, gone to 30, 35, 40, fully mature wheat straw, cereal rice straw, that's going to be 70, lots and lots of carbon, not much nitrogen. So, it's going to stick around. So again, it all depends on what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish?
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, the Tire Winder. One of the greatest costs that we have as regenerative ranchers is our labor. The Tire Winder is here to help you reduce your labor costs by giving you a tool that not only helps you roll out up to 2 wires of Super 9 poly braid on a reel that holds up to half a mile of Super 9 poly braid. You can roll 2 of those out at one time, but you can also wind those 2 wires up simultaneously as you drive back down the fence line, picking up your posts. It comes with a basket for the front of your four-wheeler to put your posts in. It comes with everything you need to get going. You buy the wire, wind it on the spools, and you're ready to go. So I'm looking forward to the labor savings that are going to come to our house as we are rotationally grazing our sheep, cows, and horses together in one mob this summer. And we are going to get our tire winder up and going here in the near future, and we're looking forward to that labor savings as well. To start saving on the labor involved in electric fencing today, go to tirewinder.com. Earlier you mentioned the process of establishing perennials, starting perennials as a cover crop in an existing perennial stand. What are some of the guidelines or things that people need to be thinking about there?
Yeah, well, again, I mentioned earlier that it's almost impossible to get an annual cool season established into a perennial cool season. And it's difficult. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's just difficult to get a cool season perennial established into an already existing cool season perennial stand. Now, if your stand has really thinned out, that makes it easier because again, it's a competition for resources. And the number one resource is going to be sunlight. A lot of people think, well, it's going to be water limited or it's going to be limited on nitrogen. And yeah, those are going to be factors, but the number one thing is going to be sunlight. If your existing perennial, is 12 inches tall and you're trying to get alfalfa or clover or chicory or plantain, which are tiny little seeds, and that's going to be a tiny little plant that comes out of the ground. If that's just buried down under the canopy of everything else, it's going to be really hard for it to survive. So, typically what we would want to see here is we would want to try to establish those sorts of things. And typically what it is people wanting to establish either a legume like, clover, alfalfa, lespedeza, something like that, or a forb like chicory or plantain or small burnet, wanting to try to establish that in something that's primarily grass. And so, we would be looking at somewhere in that late summer type time frame, kind of like when you would typically establish alfalfa, end of August, 1st of September for, a lot of us in the high plains or Midwest area. And again, we would want to try to put that perennial at a little bit of a disadvantage. I've had people do a light herbicide application that won't kill it, but it will kind of knock it back. Or again, a really tight grazing or a really short mowing. Or I've even had people that have gone out and do a little bit of a light disking Again, just, you're not going to kill it because, those grass roots are really deep, but you need to set it back. You need to knock it back enough that, those little tiny plants and typically, it's all small seeded stuff that we're talking about here, as a perennial. So alfalfa, red clover, white clover, bird's foot trefoil, maybe another one you try to slip in there. And then the two forbs that we really like, chicory and plantain would be excellent ones to try to get in there as well. They're very deep rooted. They're very drought tolerant once they're established because of that deep root system. And what they do is they accumulate minerals very, very well from down deep. And so once you have those established in your pastures, or your hay fields, your mineral consumption will likely go way down because you're pulling up the natural minerals from the soil. And a tap-rooted plant is not only going to pull up things from deeper than what a fibrous plant like a grass species, but it's also going to typically have more of an ability to pull some of the minerals out of the inorganic portion of the soil. And the plants themselves aren't really doing it. It's the biology that associates with the plants, which are pulling that, out of the inorganic portion and bringing it into the plant. And then once it's in the plant, then the animals, of course, can consume it. And then if you're managing it right and, you're grazing and you're moving, now those minerals are, 80%, 75, 80% of those minerals are coming out the back end of that animal. So now they're there for the next year. And so you start to build that cycle now. Whereas again, if you're haying it, that is going to be lost and you're not going to build, that mineral supply like you would through graze.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that something that you, is that, so yeah, would you think about prepping that ground, in any other ways, like maybe even bale grazing the year before or anything like that?
Yes, possibly. Certainly bale grazing the year before, would give you, all manner of, carbon. And actually, if I was bale grazing, I would probably get my perennials. I would probably try to do a dormant seed or a frost seed situation there and then let those come up, with that intense stomping, with all that animal activity, with all that carbon. I think if you waited until the next, if you did that through the winter and then waited till late August to try to establish it, you'd have something's going to want to really grow fast after a bale grazing. So if you want certain things to be there, you better get the seed out there kind of at that same time.
Sure. Yeah. And so would that be something that you would no-till or broadcast or what?
In a bale grazing situation, just a broadcast because, those animals are going to work it in.
Yeah.
And we always get questions, people ask questions about, well, can I feed, the clover or the alfalfa through the mineral box and, just let them, poop it out all over the place. And, and certainly that there is some effectiveness to that. It's a cheap way to seed as far as application because the cows are doing it for free. I don't know that it's a really efficient use of your seed because that's not all coming back through. Some of that is going to get digested. And certain things are better than others. Things with really hard seed coats are going to pass through the digestive tract much better than some of the softer seeded stuff. So that's not the ideal way to do it, but it is kind of a cheap and easy way as far as, it requires no equipment.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think, or would you say there's a hierarchy of strategies like this one's going to be probably more reliable than another, as far as establishing those perennials in perennials, like bale grazing might be lower on the list of effective strategies than some others, or what would you think?
I think the bale grazing is going to be really effective if you have, a relatively small, because you're not, if you have a big ranch, you're not going to be able to bale graze at all. But you may bale graze some of it every year. And so I would definitely be out there, scattering my clover, my chicory, my plantain, whatever you're going to do. Because again, it costs almost nothing to just go out there and broadcast seed. Nothing as far as equipment required, and that's a pretty fast process. And then bale graze over the top of that. Maybe you're doing 40 acres a year, 80 acres a year, whatever it is. You don't have to, and you probably shouldn't try to do it all at once. So that wouldn't be a bad strategy. If I was doing a larger area, wider scale, and didn't have, the bale grazing uh, ability, then that's when I would be looking at that late summer, early fall, and again, scratch that up a little bit, with a little bit of tillage or a pretty aggressive harrow or something. Or like say, I know people have even done a little bit of a herbicide application. We don't make herbicide recommendations, but you can kind of zing your grass back just a little bit. And if you have weeds out there, maybe it'd be an opportunity to clean that, because here's the thing: once you get these broadleaves established, clover, alfalfa, chicory, plantain, you no longer can go out there with 2,4-D and clean up your thistles and weeds and, graze on, because you're going to take all that out. So, keep that in mind. If you go to all the work and expense of establishing these things, you need to probably be willing to live with a few of the other broadleaf weeds that come along. They're forbs as well. And certainly, there's weedy species that aren't going to be grazed very well, by cattle. But I know you mentioned you have sheep, they may actually preferentially graze some of those things. And so could be a strategy where you either need to get some sheep or find somebody that does have sheep and come in and help clean that up or graze that up. Or, a lot of times those broadleaf weeds are coming in because of mismanagement, how you've grazed anyway. And most likely, if you change that grazing strategy to, an amp grazing where you're grazing pretty intensely for a very short period of time and then moving off, generally in a few cycles, a lot of the, broadleaf weed situations clear themselves up.
And similar to what you said earlier about, the chicory and those other deep rooted plants are going to be pulling things to the surface. I really think that's what weeds are doing too. In general, they are pulling nutrients to the surface. They're nature's cover crop, as people would say. And so, take it as a lesson in your management, and trust that if you get your management in line, they're not going to be there forever. Something better is going to take their place eventually. And along those lines, do you look at these ideas of whether it's annuals or perennials that we're establishing into some of these older tired hayfields, that those species aren't going to be the last new species that come eventually as things continue to improve? They're going to create space for other species in the latent seed bank to express themselves too. Have you seen that work in your experience?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. And I think that's where bale grazing will bring a lot of those latent things, to life, because your soil is getting the signal, from the carbon, from the biology, from the diversity that, hey, it's time to go. And so I think you can recruit a lot of that seed in that seed bank, by doing things like that. And I think also, and I think this would be a really interesting thing for people to try if they wanted to, even if you didn't bale graze, you could take a portion of your hay field and either hay it really early so you got some pretty good regrowth, and then essentially do a stockpile graze on that in kind of the off season. And again, don't do the whole thing, but if you had, say 20 acres that you did that on, and you just did a late season, even a warm season stockpile graze, so you let the grass or whatever it is grow up pretty tall, and then you stock it really heavily and graze it for a really short period of time. It's essentially like bale grazing, but everything is standing in the field and not out. And in some areas, like where you're at, Clay, where you're relatively dry anyway, you could windrow graze too, which would be a much lower investment than bale grazing because, you don't have the expense of putting it in a bale and placing the bales, so windrow grazing can be the same type of a deal because what it does, it's like a stockpile graze, but you're capturing the grass, so you're capturing your forage at a much more beneficial stage of nutrients. Where if you just let it go, out, it's going to get kind of stemmy, and that's why you have to stock it really heavy, force them to eat it, force them to trample it, do that, kind of that, deep massage. Neil Dennis, from Canada used to talk about that deep massage, in where he'd, load up with 1,000,000 pounds of beef an acre and, move every few hours and just basically, do the big buffalo herd type impact. I think that would stimulate a lot of your latent seed bank as well, and could be that same type of an effect. And if I was going to do that, I would think that I would get some latent seed bank, but I would also be scattering some of the seeds that I wanted out there ahead of that also.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. What about is there value in applying anything from a microbiology standpoint for some of these strategies of either annuals or perennials? I think that some of this ground, like when we first got here, there was places where it was really easy to put your hand on the ground and not touch a plant. There's just so much bare ground out there. And so I think that kind of betrays also some pretty big issues underground as well, right? With the community not being quite there that you need to get some of these things going. So would you see any benefit of trying some of those kinds of applications to also assist in getting some of this stuff off the ground?
Yeah, great question. Yes. And so there's a couple ways to think about that. Number one, the easiest and cheapest way to get biology into your soil is through a seed treatment because the application rates are very low because you just simply can't put too much liquid or powder. The seed's only going to hold so much. And so, we're generally talking, 6 to 7 fluid ounces per 100 pounds of seed. So that typically, is going to cost, a couple bucks an acre. It's just not going to cost that much to do a good compost extract, something like that, a biological package. We got a couple different things that have some, rhizobia if you're doing, any type of legume, but there's also a lot of free living nitrogen fixers, like azospirillum and zotobacter and pseudomonas and things like that, you can put on the seed really relatively inexpensively. Are they all going to work? Probably not all going to work, but it's relatively inexpensive to put that out there and to try that. The thing that is going to cost more money, being a little bit more of an investment, and wouldn't necessarily just be a no-brainer in my opinion, like the couple bucks an acre for the seed treatment, and that'd be the mycorrhizal fungi inoculation. And if you don't feel like you've got much colonization out in your fields, and if it's a perennial, there probably is some, but if it's a really thin stand or it's just really been abused, I don't know, maybe not. You could send that in for a test, you can send your soil in for a test and see what kind of colonization you have. But you can't just necessarily spread mycorrhizal spores on top of the ground and expect them to work. The best delivery mechanism for those is going to be a seed. And you can certainly use an annual seed to do that because the mycorrhiza, will colonize most of the plants in your soil, and they will go from, one plant to another and build bridges and networks. And so you can put it into the soil via an annual plant and then get it to colonize your perennials. And so, that's a good way. So if you were doing a new perennial planting, 100%, you should always inoculate with mycorrhizas. Again, that's a no-brainer because, hey, I'm going to have this stand out there for 20 years. A full rate of a mycorrhizal inoculant package is probably going to cost you 12, 13 bucks an acre. That's just a no-brainer for something that's going to be out there that long. Now, if it's already established and you don't know if you have some, you don't know that you don't, it might be worth spending the money and sending some soil into a lab and just asking for an analysis of, mycorrhiza colonization. And that's not necessarily going to be a soil test. That's going to be a test of the roots of the plant, because that's where the mycorrhiza is living, is in those roots. So that's what needs to be tested, not just the soil. And then if you think you're a little short or you want to add some in, that you could put it into some sort of an annual interseed, or into, if you're going to try to establish chicory and plantain or clover alfalfa, like we've talked about, that would be the place to put it.
Sure. Yep. How do you think about cover crop mix families? Like there's going to be, you need to have some of this and some of that, and like these kind of species in every mix, or in a mix that we're using to regenerate a hayfield specifically. Are there certain things like always this, maybe less frequently that, and some of those kinds of things?
Yeah. Well, if we look at, again, how God created these plants to live together, to work together, to cooperate together, we see a great amount of diversity. And again, Dr. Jones, when she was here, she was talking about, when you look at the native prairie, the majority of the biomass is going to come from the grasses, but the majority of the species are not going to be grasses. But when you look at our fields, it's the majority of the biomass and the majority of the species are all grasses. And so with these other things, we're not necessarily trying to crowd the grass out of its position as king of biomass, because they're always going to hold that title. But we need all of these other things out there to supplement and to support these other microbial communities that are helping the soil do all these functions, whether it be, taking the atmospheric nitrogen and making it available to the system, or, pulling, most of our soils are very rich in these minerals that we're putting on as fertilizers, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, boron, manganese. Well, those are in our soils. They're just not available to plant roots, and they're not available to all biology. And so we need to have as much a diverse microbial community out there as possible. And you're only going to get that with a diverse plant community, a diverse plant population. So typically, we don't need more grasses, because most of these perennial settings have enough grasses, and all grasses are in one plant family. All grasses are one plant family. All the legumes are in one plant family as well. So if you've already got some clover, some alfalfa, some trefoil out there, you could try to get a little bit more out there, but you wouldn't be adding another plant family. So again, a lot of times people think, well, if I could just have 6 kinds of legumes out there, I'd really have it fixed. Well, not necessarily, because, you could have 20 species out there, but if it's all grasses and legumes, you've only got 2 plant families. And so we really need to get into these other broadleaves to start looking at where the diversity comes of having, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 different plant families represented, because like chicory is in a different plant family than what plantain is. It's all Burnet is in a different plant family. And so again, you don't need lots of those out there. You go out and look at a native perennial pasture, if you don't stop and look underneath the grass, you would think it was just almost all grass. But when you start looking and start observing and start analyzing, the majority of the species are not going to be grass, even if the majority of the biomass is. Now, how does this apply in a hayfield situation? Well, I don't know. I think it's going to be hard to get those established, and it's going to be hard to keep them out there, in a haying situation. Probably going to be a much more reasonable goal to get, your 5, 6, 7 plant family type blend in a grazing situation, where you can manage the timing so much better with animals running through than with haying equipment. Because with hay equipment, your timing is almost exactly the same every year. And so it's just going to self-select for, the things that do well in that time period. And the other things go away. It would be no different than if you grazed your pastures the exact same time every single year. You would all of a sudden have very few species out there as well. And so you can't really adjust your haying times all that well. But again, that's where if possible, if you could take a percentage of that hay ground and do a really intense grazing, maybe it's only once every 8 years or 6 years or 10 years. I don't know what it is, but if you could do that, now you disrupt all those timings. You reignite some of that latent seed bank. You could introduce other things into that. Those are the sorts of things that are going to stimulate it. It's what I like to think of. One of the principles of soil health is to minimize disturbances. But really what we're talking about is disturbing that system that you've created. And so I like to think of it as optimizing your disruption. So you're disrupting the system that you've built, and you're trying to optimize it, both from a timing standpoint as well as, what you're getting in there, because, nature will figure you out pretty quick. And if you keep throwing fastball after fastball after fastball, pretty soon everybody's hitting a home run off you. And so you gotta throw the change up, you gotta throw the curveball, and you gotta have more than a fastball if you're going to stay ahead of the diseases and the insects and all the pests.
I love a good baseball analogy. So, yeah, no. Do you think that the lack of diversity in our operations is mostly due to repetitive, disturbance or grazing or haying at the same time of the year, or is it lack of moisture at different times of the year? Maybe some of both.
Well, certainly some of both, and certainly, the more arid your climate is, the more that, lack of moisture is to blame. But I don't know that we can say that totally, because again, look at how it used to be. We're not necessarily getting a whole lot less moisture than, what they would have gotten 100 years ago, but our landscape is completely different. And it's not the rainfall that's changed. It's the cultural practices. It's the timing of that, harvest, whether the harvest is through an animal or through a machine. When that timing is so consistent year after year after year after year, especially when it's so extractive, in addition to being so consistent, which in a hay situation is what you have, that's where it's a race to the bottom of diversity when it comes to that. But, that's no different than people growing corn and soybeans. It's the same thing. We're doing the same timings, the same plants. And that's why, there's now all these genetically modified crops and all the technology that has to go into the seed, because, well, guess what? The pests and the insects and diseases have figured it out. If you plant corn, soybean, or wheat, or whatever it is, it does not take nature very long to figure that out.
Yeah. God designed an adaptive system, and hence we need to have adaptive management because it will adapt to us, like you said.
Yeah. And, we don't know what the weather's going to give us. There's no such thing as normal anymore. And average tells us nothing. I was talking to someone from the Southeast United States earlier this year, and they said, yeah, last year we had a drought and a flood in the same year. And I said, and history will say you were average for moisture. and that's exactly right. They had average moisture, but they had 6 months of almost nothing, and then, a month of just, over the top rainfall. And so they had a drought and a flood with average precipitation. So there's no such thing as average. There's no such thing as normal anymore. Really, all we can do is become as resilient as possible. And, I like thinking of the term resilient so much better than climate smart or, climate change farming. I try not to get sucked into that conversation, because the climate's always going to be changing, and we don't know what it's going to do. But if we can build in resiliency, and that resiliency is going to come through diversity, then regardless of whether we have a drought, a flood, some of both. We're going to be the best prepared as possible for it, because we have some species that are going to do better in this situation and some that will do better in this. And that's how we try to design cover crop mixes, to build resiliency in them through diversity. And if I give you a 12-way mix, not all 12 of those things are all going to shine. But I promise you, if you plant that same mix year after year, it will look like different mixes every single time, because your environment is going to call different things out, and you don't know what those things are at the time.
Yeah, and your soil is going to be more conducive over time to different portions of that mix, and yeah, we've definitely seen that on our place, just in the couple of cover crops that we've experimented with here. That it is the year is going to determine what shows up as much as anything.
Yeah,
for sure.
And
For sure.
typically, when you try to outguess what that's going to be, you rarely guess correctly.
Right.
that's a gamble. It's a little bit like playing the roulette wheel. You'll hit it once in a while, but more often than not, the house is going to win.
Right. Yep. Just keep showing up, being consistent, and let the things that come be the things that you use that year in the way that is going to best set you up for more success next year, I think is probably the best.
To be honest, guys with livestock, they're in such a much better place to be able to do this than guys with just crops. I love, I think we've all learned tons of stuff from Gabe Brown and folks like him. And one of the things that we can learn from Gabe's story is that, he's never had a crop loss because he's had the cattle, even when he's droughted out or even hail. He can always recover some of that or a little bit of that, or come in after that and plant. There's things you can plant and grow for 30 days and then still get some utilization, some grazing out of it. But if you don't have cattle, then that is a complete loss. A hailstorm middle of the season, what are you going to do? And so the livestock guys really have a big advantage over just strictly crop guys, because they have so much, so many more options, in taking their crops through the animal instead of through a combine. And it's sad that, many people have gotten rid of the livestock in order to scale the crops. And I think that has come at a cost of not having the flexibility of being able to, send it through an animal instead of through a machine.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, I think all of these things are not necessarily even what you own, but what you can plumb your network to find. Like we don't own any haying equipment here, but our neighbors cross our land to hay about 90 acres of their place, and so we usually end up trading something for that. And one of those things has been they have cut our hayfield a couple of times and left it in windrows, and we windrow grazed it, and so, or they've planted or they actually sprayed out some of that for planting cover crops and other, just whatever you got to do to negotiate some of those things. There's always opportunities, and there's always somebody nearby who owns cows who'd probably rather be feeding or grazing them than having to feed them or lock them up or whatever. And so there's opportunities to bring in those outside cattle if you need it, and get that system going in the right direction.
Yeah. I did a talk for a group earlier this spring on being innovative and having an innovative spirit. And one of the things that goes along with innovation is being a pioneer, not being afraid to be out there, on the edge, being the first out there to do things or try that. But as I was putting this talk together, I was looking at these family history books that my mom had put together, and she did, pretty deep dive into family history and had all these pictures of our ancestors farming, here, 100 years ago, 125 years ago. And here's what struck me is that there is a big difference between being a pioneer and being a mountain man. So we need to be pioneers because we need to not be afraid to go out onto new frontiers, try new things, to push the boundaries, push edges. But in almost all of these pictures, you did not see people working by themselves. You saw threshing crews. You saw haying crews. You saw these pioneers band together to do things just like what you're talking about. Hey, neighbor, I'll trade you this for that. And uh, we don't see that anymore. We farm like mountain men, because mountain men, they're going out there too, but they're doing it almost exclusively by themselves. And if they slip and fall, they're probably dead.
Yeah.
There's nobody there, there's nobody there to pick them up. But a pioneer, has neighbors, and a pioneer has relationships, and a pioneer has others that they can count on. And that's what we need. We need to not be afraid to try new things, but we shouldn't feel like we have to try them on our own and by ourselves. And so a true pioneer, I think, is really building a lot of these relationships, because I can't afford my own thrashing machine, or I can't afford my own, harvest team. But you know what? I can pitch in and I can help. And we have lost so much of that in the way that we farm today. You look at, the Amish communities and some of these, and they still have that. And it's, sometimes I look at that and I'm maybe a little jealous, maybe a little sad, that has largely been lost. And one of the comments I made, there's nothing like a bunch of farm neighbors to come together, band together, and support someone when they've been injured, or that family when someone's been killed. But why does it have to take a tragedy to do that? Why can't we do more of that when things are going good and we're healthy, and just that spirit of cooperation? And so I don't know how we get back to that, Clay, but I think somehow we have to figure out how to bring more of that back. And the regenerative mindset is that way, because we're not just regenerating our soils. We need to regenerate our relationships with our neighbors, with the land, with our creator, and that will regenerate our communities then as well.
Amen. Yeah, I saw that talk live. It was very good, or at least I saw one time you gave that talk live. It was very good, and by the time this episode's out, it should be up on the Profitable Ag Steward YouTube channel, and I'd highly encourage you all to go out and find that, because it was very good. And I heard somebody else the other day talking about that they had some friends or some people that they were aware of that, they do farm that way. And, why does everybody have to own a combine? Yeah. Why doesn't one family own the air seeder, and the other family own the combine, and the other family own, whatever, and the other family own the cows? How about that? And we cooperate that way.
The answer, it's because building relationships can be harder than building a farm.
Yep.
And sometimes we're not willing to do the hard work of building those relationships. And I think part of it is because people have tried things like that and have been burnt, by a neighbor. And a lot of that I think a lot of that could be avoided by just being very, very clear. You don't have to necessarily have contracts, but you need to have things written down. Even within a family, you should have, just so there's not a misunderstanding. So it's like when I'm working with somebody who's wanting to order seed, I like to do a lot of it through email if possible, so I have a written record of what I told someone, because I'm not going to remember what I told you, Clay. If we had a phone conversation, if I don't write it down, if I don't have a record I can go back to, well then it's a he said, she said type thing. And that's where relationships get broken and feelings get hurt and divides get driven in. And it's like, okay, I'm going to be a mountain man. I'm just going to go out on my own.
Yep, for sure. Well, Keith, anything else that comes to mind as far as this regenerating hay fields topic is concerned? Anything we missed? Resources that you would recommend?
I'm sure there is, because, there's lots of, I love working with farmers, because the creativity just, flows out when people try things. And so, like I said, try a grazing experiment on some, or maybe try, haying earlier on some of it, and then letting, having more regrowth, and, whether you dormant graze that, or just let those plants build root systems. Just try different things. Don't do the same thing over and over and over again, because you're just driving that system into the ground. So if you are to the point where you have to have the hay production, well, then just think think creatively inside that box, get out to the edges of the box at least, of how can you, switch things up? How can you, if you're in a relatively dry area where you can swath graze, wow, great way to do it. Bale graze, those are opportunities to rebuild and revitalize those fields, because otherwise it's just 100% extractive if you're not bringing any of those nutrients back somehow.
Yeah. If it takes you a whole month to do your haying, start in a different place every year, and that'll make a huge difference. Just varying your season of use by a month is going to make a big difference. And the second thing I would say is, if you're going to do something like swath grazing, that doesn't mean it has to be used in the depths of winter. For us, actually, when we swath grazed, they cut it during their normal haying season. I wasn't going to ask them to put everything away and then bring it back out, and so they cut it during their normal grazing season or haying season. And there was some loss because those swaths were out there through our second round of cool season growth in September. We always last year we didn't, but usually we get a good shot of rain in September, and those cool seasons will kick back up again. And so there was some impact by having those swaths there. So it might have even been a better thing to say, hey, we captured this in a good nutrient place. Let's graze it in August and get that off of there so that when that cool season hit of moisture comes, it's ready to grow again. So lessons learned, but I think that sometimes we get locked into those paradigms of, oh, that's a winter thing. That's something I'm going to use in the winter. Doesn't have to be. So,
and with the advent of better fencing technology, and, I'm excited to see where some of this virtual fencing type stuff could go. That could really open up possibilities of people moving the animals out of the perennial pastures and into some of these hay fields. You're still going to have to do work at doing it, but it could be far more practical to do it, especially in that off season. So again, just, keep your eyes open for all, that you utilize the best tools that are out there, utilize the best timing, and then, do your homework of seeing what other people are doing, and just, think out on the edges of the box if you can't get outside the box.
Yep. Very good. Keith, I really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Anytime, Clay. Thank you.
Very good stuff there with Keith. Really appreciate his perspective and just the breadth of experience that he has on so many different kinds of acres, and the help that Green Cover Seeds offers to producers who are looking to take that next step, speed up biological time in their regenerative journey. So looking forward to next week. We're going to have a theme here, talking to John Hayes and Jeremy Sweeten next week on the podcast. And we're going to talk to them about, can haymaking be regenerative? So we've talked about, industrial scale nutrient exportation on most of our hay ground in this country, and the problems that presents and the difficulty of regenerating those acres today. But if we just maybe tweak our approach a little bit, we can see haymaking be regenerative as well. And we're going to talk to Jeremy Sweeten and John Hayes of Understanding Ag about how they have come to believe or see that their haymaking equipment can pass the tests of the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes. So look forward to that coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.